as you can see, I like to start off fairly subtly. So some years ago, I was, quite a few years ago, I was watching TV, and I remember watching this journalist in disgust translating. There was a Palestinian protest going on, one of the latest Israeli atrocities at the time, and he was, as they kind of, they changed their tone of voice to show their disapproval or approval, showing his disapproval and disbelief that they could chant. They were actually chanting death to Israel, I think, these Palestinians, and he was basically showing his disgust for that and almost his acceptance of this Israeli atrocity, because obviously they didn't recognise, that the Palestinians didn't recognise the state of Israel and wanted its destruction. So I guess what I'm doing is I'm going to look at the history and argue that actually I believe that's a valid argument, that it's a racist state, and that that the racist state should be destroyed. That doesn't mean the people within the state, but that means the racist state should be destroyed. So that's basically the argument of this talk. So Zionism is a racist ideology that sees nationalism or nationhood as based on race. It emerged in Eastern Europe towards the end of the 19th century, and it was a reactionary movement created in response to anti-Semitic programs in capitalism, largely in Eastern Europe, and capitalism Russia. The weak but aspiring Russian and Polish bourgeoisie, whose future already looked fairly bleak, saw the long-established Jewish petty bourgeoisie as rivals and easy scapegoats for their own inability to make progress. So the dictatorial regimes of Eastern Europe, especially Tsarist Russia, were quick to see they could use anti-Semitism to split and stifle opposition, whether liberal opposition or more radical opposition of the emerging working class. So these programs led to mass immigration of Eastern European Jews towards Western Europe and America. Some of this anti-Semitism also spread into Western Europe and was a propaganda tool used by the most reactionary political forces there. Theodor Herzl was Zionist's most famous kind of promoter or founder, and in 1896 he published his work, The State of the Jews. As Norman Finkelstein, a historian of Jewish descent, points out, and an anti-Zionist points out, much of Herzl's thinking is founded in the right-wing sources such as Hans Cohen's concept of pan-Germanism. The irony of such thinking is that they basically took the ideology that was being used against them to justify the creation of their own state based on the similar ideology. The Jewish people would form, according to him, a portion of the rampart against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. So this was very much a European colonial project, a white European colonial project at the time. So while support for Zionism grew slowly amongst European Jews in the early 1900s, the Zionists still needed the backing of a major European power. And in 1917, a leading Zionist, Chaim Weizmann, got the support of Britain by linking the Zionist cause with the needs of British imperialism in the Balfour Declaration. This declaration recognised the possibility of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine for the return of Jewish support for British sole governments there. And this is kind of the second major foundation of the Zionist state. The first being their race-based ideology, the second being their willingness, but not only their willingness, their need to serve imperialist interests. Because unlike most colonies, say, set up, like the British colonies set up, which had the backing of the British state, they weren't from any specific state. So they needed the backing of a major power to be able to impose the state anywhere they were. So that's why they've always had to serve the interests of imperialism. And that's probably why I tend to, with the argument when people talk about, a lot of more conspiracy people talk about that America does what Israel says. I think it's still the other way around, because it's Israel that needs the backing of America to carry out and maintain its state. So as the imperialists split up the spoils of the Ottoman Empire between themselves, the Palestine was part of the booty that Britain grabbed, and in 1922 Britain got the League of Nations to grant it mandate over all of Palestine. And the Balfour Declaration was included verbatim in the text, together with several detailed provisions for facilitating Zionist colonisation. So in 1919 the Jewish population was roughly 58,000. By 1944 it had increased to 528,702. So much for the myth. There was a movie, I can't think of the name of it. Exodus, that was it. And it was sort of the myth that the British were holding back Jewish immigration. So much for that myth. In all colonisations, indigenous people are dispossessed, but what becomes of them? I've broken this, well, in this case we've broken it down into two main models. So there are two main models of colonisation in settler society. In one, the indigenous population is harnessed as a labour force to be exploited, a source of surplus value. In the other, they are excluded from the settler's economy, marginalised, exterminated or expelled, ethnically cleansed. South Africa would be an example of that first type, and Israel would be an example of the second type. So as Herzl noted in his diary in 12th of June 1895, he said, we shall try to transfer the poorer sections of the indigenous population across the border without raising noise, by giving them employment in transit countries. But in our own country, we shall deny them all work. A first-hand account of this Zionist policy in action before the establishment of Israel comes from Yuval Hopkinson, who later became Tony Cliff, or known as Tony Cliff, a left-wing theorist and political leader in Britain. But I thought he had this interesting excerpt from something he was saying when he was living there in 1944. In 1944, we lived near Tel Aviv market. One morning, my wife saw a young man going around talking to all the women selling produce. Some he left alone, but others had paraffin poured on their vegetables, and their eggs were smashed. My wife, who had only just come from South Africa, couldn't believe it. What's going on, she asked. It was simple. The man checked if the produce was Hebrew or Arab, and destroyed Arab produce. He then goes on to talk about the kibbutz movement. No Arab ever entered the kibbutz movement, the so-called socialist collective farms. The majority of Jewish-owned land belonged to the Jewish National Fund, whose constitution forbade Arab tenants. This meant the whole areas of Arab population was driven out. When I left Palestine in 1946, Tel Aviv, a city of 300,000, had no Arab residents left. Imagine turning up in Nottingham, a similar-sized town, and finding no English people. So right from before the establishment of Israel, the Zionists were preparing the ground to expel the Arab inhabitants. All the world's main powers voted for the partition of Palestine, which was imposed under the authority of the UN on May 14, 1948. It gave 56% of the land to the Zionists, the vast majority of whom were recent European immigrants, and who made up just over 30% of the population. By 1950, over 70% of the Palestinians, over 900,000 out of 1.4 million, had been expelled from their land by the use of military force in one of the 20th century's most successful and brutal campaigns of ethnic cleansing. Today, 92% of the land inside Israel is reserved for Jews only. Non-Jews, the great majority of whom are Palestinians, make up 18% of the Israeli population, but are not allowed to buy, lease or sell this land. They live as virtual outcasts in their own country, denied full citizenship by the racist Israeli state. I believe we can get some direction of an effective strategy from the current, well, not it was current when I wrote this talk the first time, Israeli Prime Minister. I'll admit, had this to say in an Israeli newspaper, Haaretz. More and more Palestinians are uninterested in a negotiated two-state solution because they want to change the essence of the conflict from an Algerian paradigm to a South African one, from a struggle against occupation to a struggle for one man, one vote. That is, of course, a much cleaner struggle, a much more popular struggle, and ultimately a much more powerful one. For us, it would mean the end of the Jewish state. I believe it is the right and the duty of all progressive people in New Zealand to support the Palestinian struggle and their right to resistance. We must go beyond just moral support, and I believe we must not give them material support. To concretely support their right to resistance and our right to support and show solidarity with their resistance. To that effect, Obviously today we're launching a solidarity campaign with the PFLP, the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Part of this campaign to raise funds for them is these t-shirts, okay, and the profits of which will go to the PFLP.